everybody, it's Wednesday. A couple of months ago, I made a video about the deconstruction of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope in one of my favorite movies. And this week, I wanted to revisit it in one of my favorite books, which just so happens to be coming out as a movie this week. That said, I decided I would revisit the trope in the context of Paper Towns. Paper Towns is my favorite John Green book, and it's my favorite because of the way that it deals with this trope. There's this idea that I love that pervades throughout the book, that the idealization of people is toxic. Thinking of people as more than what they are will only end in destruction and complete misery. The idea that people will magically change you, or will make some part or all of your life fun and interesting because they're beautiful or mysterious or different will only set you up for disappointment. I try to live by this idea, only partially because of Paper Towns. I've read all of John Green's books, and that's not me bragging. I'm just familiar with the fact that John gets rightfully frustrated at people that make completely wrong comments about his books because they haven't read them. Their arguments usually surround this idea that John is somehow perpetuating toxic tropes and concepts, especially about young women and mentally and physically ill people. But I'm of the mind that John points these things out because he wants them to change or to legitimize them in a society that doesn't see them that way. So our narrator and main character Q meets this girl Margo when they're young children, and immediately he's enamored by her. They become friends and remain friends for a while, but by the time they're about to graduate high school, Margo seems to have completely forgotten about Q. He's still in love with her, mind you. Throughout the book, Q constantly puts Margo on a pedestal. From the get-go, she's this ethereal, wonderful miracle, as Q calls her. Something to be constantly sought after, but never pinned down and never fully understood as a complex human being. John said in a post on his official website, Margo is certainly presented by Q as a Manic Pixie Dream Girl at the beginning of Paper Towns, but that only acknowledges that some boys believe in Manic Pixie Dream Girls. It doesn't argue that Manic Pixie Dream Girls actually exist, or that Margo is one. Margo knows that people are looking at her the way Q does, and she definitely knows that Q looks at her this way, and I'm sure that's why she kind of ignores Q throughout their entire friendship. John relates this idea directly to Q, that the narrator and the author are almost never the same person. Paper Towns is written in first person, meaning that John has given the reader no reason to believe that he is Q. A first-person narrator is literally a character within the story, telling the events of the story through their own perspective. An author doesn't play the character. The character comes to life, and the first-person narrator is in complete control of the story. All the author is doing is providing the medium in which the character can tell the story and identify with their audience. But unless you're writing nonfiction, and Paper Towns is definitely not nonfiction, although there are some tiny autobiographical parts throughout the story, you, the author, are not synonymous with the narrator. Q's experiences and affections for Margo are in no way supposed to be a reflection of John the author because they are distinctly Q's thoughts and feelings. But back to the book. Spoiler alert, but not really. Margo goes missing. As Q goes on a journey to find her, little by little he learns more about her and is able to imagine her as a complex human being with flaws and mistakes, rather than this being that is perfectly matched to his desires and needs. This sets Q apart from one of John's earlier protagonists, Pudge, from Looking for Alaska, where Q is forced by Margo to imagine Margo Roth-Spiegelman as just Margo. Pudge is never able to see Alaska as anything but his great perhaps. Something that is really hard to explain, but Pudge and Alaska talk about it throughout their story. Pudge's inability to move past his idealization of Alaska and see her as a troubled girl with real-world problems literally drives Alaska away until she can't be his great perhaps anymore. Now, all of that sounds very philosophical and whatnot, but when it comes down to it, to me, Looking for Alaska and Paper Towns run in somewhat of the same vein. The idealization of women that the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope is based on is not only toxic and misogynistic, but also can be lethal. What I love so much about the end result of Paper Towns is not that Q finds Margo, but that when he does, she straight up tells him that she is not who he thought she was and that she never was that person. And in part, I think that has to do with the fact that Margo doesn't really know who Margo is. That's the whole reason she leaves Orlando. to find herself on her own terms. Self-exploration is a huge part of life, and the more that this book remains my favorite of John's, the more I love that part of the human experience. Q's affection for Margo doesn't change the fact that she is her own person, and there's no reason for us to believe that it would, except that Margo isn't telling the story, Q is. Q seems to believe for the majority of the journey that if he finds her and tells her how he feels about her, that he'll be able to convince her to come home, go to college in Orlando, and resume life as if nothing had ever changed. But it did. And Q comes to accept the fact that he can't change that. He goes home. Life moves on without his manic pixie dream girl. Okay, go see Paper Towns at the end of this week. Read the book too, but the movie I'm sure is going to be amazing after having seen Tifios. I'm so excited I can't even believe it. Remember to thumbs up this video if you liked it, subscribe down here if you want to see more videos like this, and the Scrivener and I will see you next week.